Law enforcement is preparing for potential protests in the wake of the indictment of former President Trump. The NYPD issued a memo yesterday requiring all officers to be prepared for deployment in the case of, quote, unusual disorder. There is reason why police are taking seriously the potential for violence in the wake of Trump's indictment. Nearly 2 weeks ago, Trump called for mass protests. He referred to the Manhattan DA as an animal and a danger who should be removed. He told his supporters the country is being destroyed and that prosecutors are doing the work of the devil.
Call them the Gestapo.
He amplified a threatening image suggesting the DA could be beaten with a baseball bat and warned of death and destruction if he is held accountable. Couple that with his loaded language in the past about guns and Hillary Clinton, and his continuing praise of the January 6th insurrectionists, including his collaboration with members of a prison choir who are incarcerated for attacking police. Yeah. Joining us now, former New York City Police Commissioner, the now executive chairman of the Teneo Risk, Bill Bratton, and former Secretary of Homeland Security under President Obama, Jeh Johnson, joins us.
Mr. Commissioner, what would you be doing this morning as Commissioner of NYPD?
I'm sorry, Joe, I did not hear the question. I'm sorry.
I'm just curious. What would you be doing just to prepare to prevent the next January 6th if you were running the NYPD again?
Well, the police commissioner is very busy. Her and her department began to see some of that yesterday with the increased security around the courthouse, district attorney's office. Security has been increased significantly, certainly for the district attorney and others. And the good news is that New York has great experience dealing with every type of experience in terms of whether it be terrorism or large crowds, demonstrations. And in this event, they will be watching very closely, monitoring social media, intelligence sources. I don't think you're going to see huge crowds turning out for this thing, particularly from the Trump side. Mr. Trump is not thought very well of here in New York and in Manhattan. I think you're going to have larger crowds that will be demonstrating against him rather than in support of him. In any event, the police department will be prepared to deal with it.
Commissioner Bratton, good morning. Yeah, when Donald Trump first said, I'm going to be arrested on Tuesday a couple of weeks ago, there was a small smattering, a handful of Trump supporters downtown protesting. Can you speak, though, as someone who has obviously served at the top of the New York Police Department, about the kind of resources it has, the kind of intelligence it has, and why it would be much, much more difficult and probably unwise for people to try to incite violence in Lower Manhattan?
My predecessor, Commissioner Kelly, after the events of 9/11, created a entity, almost 1,000 officers working on intelligence gathering, counterterrorism. Jeh Johnson, who I worked very closely with, sitting beside me here when he was Homeland Security Secretary during my last time as Commissioner. It's an example of the close collaboration that exists here in New York City. And New York does an extraordinary job analyzing, gathering intelligence, monitoring social media. So these demonstrations right now, they're not picking up much information about planned demonstrations. They're actually more concerned about the lone wolf, the person that they don't pick up on social media, they don't hear from. At the same time, they have phenomenal resources to bring into this issue. Last week, in anticipation of an action last week, they fielded what they called mobile field forces. They put out 10 of them. That's over 400 officers scattered around Lower Manhattan that could respond very quickly to any unplanned emerging situation. No, the NYPD, working in coordination with their counterparts and other agencies, will be very well prepared for this.
So, Mr. Secretary, we just went through what could happen, may or may not happen in Lower Manhattan, and there was just a small group of protesters last week. We also know that this morning in Palm Beach, near Mar-a-Lago, a very small group of demonstrators there as well. But it's a big country. Taking a look back from your former job, looking at the entire nation, there are certainly Donald Trump has fervent supporters throughout the country. What steps do you think federal law enforcement right now is taking in case something else were to erupt, perhaps not outside the courthouse, but in a Trump stronghold?
Well, first, I want to echo what Bill said. I have a lot of confidence in the NYPD. In 2015, when Bill was commissioner and I was secretary, we managed probably the largest domestic security operation in history with the UN General Assembly of 170 world leaders plus the Pope. So I'm sure the NYPD will be prepared here in New York. They know how to do this kind of thing. On the national scale, I am very concerned that former President Trump has abandoned all moderation in his rhetoric, in his overheated rhetoric. What he is essentially doing in talking to his base, those who, as John put it, are still under his spell, is basically take up arms against our government, state and local. And particularly after January 6th, Mr. Trump ought to know the consequences of this kind of rhetoric. You know, he will swear that I did not intend violence by my rhetoric, but there's a point where you do intend the consequences of your actions. And we've seen this with January 6th. I'm very concerned that this could be a repeat of that. I know that the Department of Homeland Security right now, as we speak, through its Intelligence and Analysis Directorate, is closely monitoring social media, all of its sources, just as is the NYPD and the FBI, looking for potential demonstrations that could turn violent on a national level, whether it's here in New York or Mar-a-Lago or any place else. And I think they need to be vigilant right now, given the former president's very overheated rhetoric.
Secretary, having said that, on the other side of it, there are a lot of emotions, people that have been anti-Trump, anti-what he stands for. I among them. How would you counsel them? Because one of the things we've been saying overnight is don't play into it. Do not be the ones that come out and try to go, as we would say, tit for tat with those that would express anger and would want to see violence. How would you counsel people that we're looking at a moment that we ought not be celebrating? Because it's a sad moment to see a former president have to do this, even though we feel it could lead to justice. How would you counsel the anti-Trump crowd that may show up, as the police commissioner here said?
Peaceful demonstration, the right to protest, is part of our values, our heritage, our history, and our culture. As you know, Reverend, Martin Luther King would counsel demonstrations, protest, but always peaceful. After George Floyd, many people, millions of Americans, took to the streets and protested in a peaceful manner. I count myself as a protester for some of the marches I was in after George Floyd, as you were. Yeah. And so peaceful demonstration, the peaceful exercise of our First Amendment rights and our freedom to assemble is part of who we are as Americans, but always peaceful.
Commissioner Bratton, we want to turn to you for a fact check, if we can. One of the talking points emanating from the right in the aftermath of this indictment is saying that DA bragged that he's too focused on Donald Trump and ignoring the crime that's happening in his backyard, the crime that's happening in Manhattan. Can you provide some context as to whether there's any truth at all to that point? What is the DA and the NYPD doing about crime each and every day here in New York City?
The district attorney's office in Manhattan is a very large operation. They have the capability to do multiple things at the same time. So the idea of the focus of his office on this case, certainly attracting a lot of resources to it. At the same time, he's got a very large operation that continue to focus on the crime situation. I've been a critic of the district attorney relative to his crime fighting in this city, so make that known. But at the same time, his office is very capable of doing the investigation of Mr. Trump's activity, while at the same time trying to focus more actively on the crime situation in New York.